So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on the art of the possible with Highcharts visualizations in Amazon QuickSight. As Maddie said, my name is Jackson Dowden. I'm a solutions architect with QuickSight, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. This will be sort of a part 2 of our previous session, which was led by my colleagues a few weeks ago. That session covered an introduction to the Highcharts visual library and covered the basics of how you can link your data, so routing data from QuickSight datasets into Highchart visuals, and included a deep dive into the process of creating and enhancing a line chart to get familiar with the chart code editor and some of the customization options available. Now, in case you missed that last session, don't worry, you can still find a recording on the Amazon QuickSight community or on the YouTube channel if you want to review that later. But for today's session, we're going to focus more on the art of the possible. So we'll be looking at some of the different chart types made available through the Highcharts library. I'll be covering how you can use Highcharts to create enhanced versions of native QuickSight visuals, as well as look at some of the new chart types that haven't previously been possible in QuickSight. And for these, we'll also discuss which ones may or may not require changes or additions to your data itself. So with that being said, here's our agenda for today. We're going to start by doing just a really quick review of what Highcharts is and some of its key features, before moving straight into a live demo to create some of those different visual types that I just mentioned. And we will also have some time for a Q&A at the end. So as an introduction, Highcharts is a popular charting library that was integrated into Amazon QuickSight at the end of 2024. With the new Highcharts visuals, you can now create custom visualizations using the Highcharts core library, which is available at no additional cost. This library allows for advanced customization options for your visuals and provides more chart type options like sunburst charts, network graphs, 3D charts, and more, a few of which we will have time to look at later today. This library is available as a new visual type within QuickSight, and you'll use the chart code editor to configure the visuals using the Highcharts JSON schema. As you will see, this code editor comes with contextual assistance features, including autocomplete and real-time validation to improve this visual creation process. And I've just put on the screen a few of the sample visuals that are provided on our DemoCentral website, where we also provide the chart code for each of these, so you can see exactly how some of these were made. So that's just a really quick intro into what Highcharts is, but now we can jump straight into a demo to build a few visuals together. So I'm just going to swap my screen share here. Go. Okay, so I'm on my browser now, and you'll see that I have a few tabs open. I've got my QuickSight tab, where we'll be making our visuals. I've also got our DemoCentral tab open to our page on Highcharts. I've got the Highcharts core library demos, and also the Highcharts API reference tab pulled up. And all of these resources are going to be very useful when we start building out the visuals, and we'll come back to each of these later. But starting on our QuickSight tab, I've started on the dataset preparation window, just so that we can all see the format of the data that we'll be working with today. So this is a US SaaS sales dataset that just has some simple order details. So each row is just a different order. We can see when the order was placed, who placed the order, where they're located. We can see what they bought, how much, how many, and for how much, as well as some categorical data like the industry and segment of that customer. So just wanted to show that this data is not very complex, doesn't have any particular enhancements or configuration or anything. It's just a simple SaaS sales data set. And to begin, I'm just going to click Publish and Visualize to open up a new analysis. We'll be using an interactive sheet. And let's start by just assuming that we want to visualize our monthly sales for this data set. We can quickly do this using a native visual, just by simply using the autograph, selecting a chart type. For today, we'll just start with an area line chart, and we'll simply provide order date and sales, and we'll aggregate our order date by month. So in just a few clicks, we can quickly and easily visualize this data. But what if we wanted to make some changes that aren't possible with the native area chart? Let's say we wanted to control the look and feel of the filled in area, like changing the color and the opacity. Currently, we can change the color. If I click in here, I can change the entire color to green, for example. But we don't have full control over like the opacity of the area, or we can't define a certain color gradient. Or let's also say we wanted to do some conditional formatting. So say we wanted to change the line and the area to be a green if sales had gone up during this period, or red if it had gone down. Currently, we can only do one or the other. So currently it's marked as green. I could come in and mark it as red, for example. But that's not using this sort of conditional color logic. We can't introduce that into these native QuickSight visuals. However, as we'll see over the next few minutes here, both of these customization options are possible when using Highcharts. So in order to use Highcharts, I'm simply going to add in a new visual. And at the very bottom here, you'll see this icon for the Highcharts visual type. So I can click this and it'll open up a new graph. And we have to provide our data the same way that we do to our other visuals. And so I'm going to provide the same data as we did to our native area chart. So I'll add in our order date and I'll change the granularity to month. And then I'll also add in our sales data. Now, in order to actually configure this Highcharts visual, we can come in here to the Format Visual panel. And specifically, we'll open up this chart code section. And you'll see that it's auto-populated with some default chart code, which is why it's rendering as a line chart for right now. So before we go ahead and start making our changes, I'm going to switch tabs to the Highcharts core demo library so we can see what options there are and we can select which chart type we actually want to build. So here we can scroll through this demos and see all the different chart types that are available. So we can see all the different types of line charts, area charts, column and bar charts, so on and so forth. But for this one to start with, we're just going to use the simple area chart, and we'll just use this first basic one. So from this demo page, we can click on each demo, like this area chart, to open it up and look at this example. And we can actually click this code button to see the sample code for this particular example visual. So I could go through here and I could read through, see exactly how this was configured. All I'm really looking for at this point is just the chart type. So I see here at the top that this is defined as a chart type area. And so we're going to take that and we're going to bring that back to our own tab in QuickSight here. And we can see that the default type was line, and I'm simply going to change that to area. Now when I click apply code, you'll see that it automatically adjusts, and now it looks more like that area chart that we're expecting. Now for the next step, I'm going to change some of the other default code that was provided. So for example, I'm just going to get rid of this name property because we don't need it. For the x-axis, instead of categories, I'm going to remove this line. And instead, I'm going to mark it as type date time. And then for our data, I'm going to have it use both of our columns by calling in 0 and 1 here and getting rid of this trailing comma. And then I'll pause for a second. And I'll just click apply code. So we have a really basic chart definition here. All we've done up to this point is we've chosen our chart type. So we marked it as a type of area. We told our x-axis that it is using time data. So now we can see that it actually is reflecting these different months, months and years along our x-axis. And then also for our data, we provided in both of our columns. So when we provide our columns on the left here, in order, it goes starting at 0. So our first one is column 0. Our next column is column 1. If we added more, those would be columns 2, 3, 4, and onwards. So in our case, we're just marking that we want to use both columns 0 and 1, which are the only two we provided, order date and sales. If any of these initial steps don't make sense, I highly recommend reviewing the linking data and hands-on sections of our DemoCentral website, which were also covered in the previous session, where they go over sort of these basic steps of linking our data from our QuickSight datasets into our Highcharts visuals. Now, before we make the two more advanced changes that I mentioned at the start, having the chart color adjust based on sales direction and adjusting the area opacity, let's make a few more small formatting adjustments. And for each of these, we can go to the Highcharts API reference tab to see what's possible. So this is what that looks like. This is what that documentation is. And here on the left, we can see all the different sections that are possible for configuring our charts. We can see things like different colors and captions, titles, tooltips, legends, X and Y axis. There's lots of different options here. We can actually expand each section. So for example, we can expand the Y-axis section and see that there's lots of sub-properties of each of these. So in the Y-axis, we have lots of different customization options, like changing the range, the tick positions, the lengths and colors of the ticks, the padding, different intervals, labels, units. There's a lot here. And for this session, we're not going to focus on going through what each and every one of these options are or what they mean. I just wanted to show the API reference so that you know where you can go to find this information as you're building out your own Highcharts visuals. So for now, I want to make a really simple change. I just want to change the title of our y-axis. So if I scroll through here, all the way at the bottom, you see that there's a property called title. And this in itself is actually a structure, so I can expand that section and see all the different formatting properties of title. So again, all I want to do is really do a simple change for the text. I can scroll through these, and the one that I'm looking for is actually called text. I can see here that this tells me this is how I control the actual text of the axis title. And in order to change it, I have to provide a string. So now that we've sort of seen the structure of that, we can come back to our QuickSight chart code editor and add that in. So if you remember, we started at the highest level, which was y-axis. So I'm just going to add a new section and start typing y-axis. And I'll use that autocomplete. And then the y-axis was itself a structure. It had lots of different properties. And what we were looking at was the title property. But then title itself was a structure. So I'm going to add in more curly braces. And now it's of title that there was that text property. And for text, we need to provide a string. So I'm going to provide a very simple string for sales. Now you'll notice before I click apply, our old y-axis had a title of values. Now that I'm providing sales, when I click apply code, you'll see that it updates to sales. So I did a really simple change here, but ultimately what I wanted to show, like there's lots of things you could do, controlling the style, size, adding $signs for formatting, things like that. But again, the focus for today isn't on going through each and every one of these customization options because we'd need a much longer session. But I suggest that when you're building the visuals yourself, you scan through some of the options in that API reference to sort of see what's possible. And if there's a specific change that you want to make, it's often easier to scroll through here and start reading through what each of these are to find the one that's most relevant to that change that you're trying to make. And again, we just followed that structure. So at the highest level was y-axis. Within that structure, we had title, and within title, we had the property of text. And so we can see that reflected in our JSON schema within the chart editor. So we can do a very similar process with the legend. I know that I don't need a legend for this visual. So I'm going to come back to our API reference, just going to collapse the title and the y-axis. And I'm going to look for the legend section, which is its own high-level parameter. When I expand legend, I can see that there's, again, lots of different formatting options. The one that I'm looking for is just simply enabled. I can click to navigate there, and I can read that this is how we enable or disable the legend, and we provide a Boolean, so just a true or false field. So once again, I'm going to come back to my chart code editor. It's another high-level option, so I'm going to come in here and start typing in legend. I can use that autocomplete, and this time it was just a property of legend called enabled. So I can type that out. And then for autocomplete, it's giving me those Boolean options, true or false. In this case, I just want to mark it as false. And when I click apply code, you'll see that that legend goes away. And also, as I've been making these changes, you can see how the code editor is also providing some autocomplete suggestions, as you just saw when I started typing legend and true or false. It also has this format code button to help with formatting. So for example, if things weren't sort of indented as needed, or if I spaces, I could click format code, and it would automatically fix that for me. Also, if I had made a mistake, like if I deleted a comma that was needed, you'll see that we get this red line and we get this little error message that says expected a comma. And we can click on that to take us to where that is expected. And so it's expected over here. And I can apply that code again just to make sure everything's fixed. Now, again, we haven't really done anything crazy at this point, and the chart looks pretty similar to the native chart we made earlier. But now we can start making the changes made possible through Highcharts. And we can start by changing the area gradient and opacity. So let's go back to the API reference. I'm just going to collapse the legend, and I'm going to go to the series section. And under here, you'll see there's a different series type for each of the different chart types. So I'm specifically going to expand for the chart type area, which is the one that we're working with currently. And again, I can read through all the different options here, but we're trying to adjust the color, so I can go straight to the color property. Now here, it tells us that we can provide 3 different types of objects to control our color. We can provide a color string, a pattern object, or a gradient color object. We can actually open this in another tab to see how we can actually define that type of gradient object. Here we can see, so this gradient color object gives us gradient options instead of a solid color. We said that there's 3 options. So we can provide either a linear gradient or a radial gradient. And then we provide, or we define the stops along that gradient. So at what points along that gradient do we want the different colors that will like make that gradient on. So we can see here that what we really are looking for is a linear gradient. And we see how that's defined here. It's defined in terms of an x1 and x2 and a y1 and y2. This is basically just for defining the direction of the gradient. So from x1 to x2 defines if it's a side-to-side gradient, and from y1 to y2 determines if it's an up and down or down to up gradient. In our case, we're going to want a vertical gradient, which is the same thing as is here, just going from y1 to y2. And then as you see here, these are the stops. So they're defining 3 stops in this example, where at the start it's one color, but halfway through it'll change to another color, and at the end it'll be a 3rd color. So now that we see how we can sort of define these colors, and we remember that it was a property underneath series, we can actually go back to our chart editor, and we'll just go ahead and copy this entire example color definition. We'll come back to our code editor, and we'll paste it in as a property under series, just below data and type. Now you'll notice when I copy and paste this in, we're getting a lot of error messages. That's because the formatting, there's lots of indentation errors, and also we don't have these double quotes around each of these properties, which is needed for the JSON definition. But we can very quickly scroll down and click Format Code, and that'll go ahead and solve all those errors. You'll notice that we do still have a couple yellow sort of warning messages saying that a different object type was expected. We can just ignore those for now. They're not errors, they're just warnings, so it's not actually going to it's not going to cause any issues in rendering our actual chart. To start with, we just copy paste this example gradient. We can go ahead and click Apply just to see what that looks like. And here we can see how by defining zeros and x's, there's no side-to-side gradient. There's only a vertical up and down gradient, which we'd expect from the definition of the y's in the linear gradient. And then for the stops, we can see that sort of at the start of the gradient, there's one color. About halfway through, it fades to another color. And then at the end, it fades into another color. So we can see how that gradient is working based off the way that they've defined the stops. For our example, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of the middle stop. We only want that first and last stop. Get rid of the comments. And instead of providing hex codes, I'm going to provide RGBA values. I've gone ahead and picked these ahead of time, but you could set these to whatever colors you want. So I'm just going to type in our RGBA strings. And now when I click Apply, you'll see that we have this solid green color now. The reason this is solid instead of a gradient is because currently I provided the exact same color for both of the stops, so there's no really gradient between them. But importantly here, because we're able to provide RGBA strings instead of just hex codes, we can actually provide a pass in a fourth option to this RGBA function. That is the opacity. So again, I picked these values ahead of time, but you could adjust these values as needed to get a look and feel that's best for your dashboards and reports. But I'm going to add in a comma here and add one more value to our last stop and add in an opacity value of 0.1. Now when I click Apply, you'll see that we have this sort of fading gradient. You can also see, again, this is a vertical gradient because of the way we've defined our linear gradient. And here, we've just defined this opacity by using these RGBA values. So we've been able to do more customization with colors, opacity, and gradients than we could in just the native chart. But now for the second step, we want to add some sort of logic so that our chart turns green when sales have increased and red when sales have decreased. And we'll define that sort of difference as the change between the first and last value. So for example, we've got like sales in our very first month versus sales in our very last month. For now, it's increasing, so we'd want it to be green. But if we changed the view of our data or got different data in here, and it was decreasing, we'd want that to render as red. So in order to look at how we can define this logic, I'm going to switch back to the slides for just a couple minutes. Okay, you should be seeing my slides now. So our goal is to find the difference between the last sales value and the first sales value, which are labeled here as sales in the first and last month, because we've set our order date granularity to monthly. So how can we find the sales in the first month? Well, to start with, the JSON expression for get column gives us an array of our values. If you remember, because of the way that we added an order date and then sales, order date is column 0 and sales is column 1. So in this case, by calling get column 1, we're going to get an array of all of our sales data. And because of the way that we've ordered our graph, it's going to be ordered sorted by month, which is our order date. So basically, this is the sales value in the first month, and then 13,900, and then 90,000 is our sales in our last month. Now, in order to get a specific value, like remember, we're looking for sales in the first month, we can use the get expression. With the get expression, we provide our values, which is the array from the previous step, and then we have to provide an index value. So our indexes start at 0. So in this array, this would be item 0, this would be item 1, so on and so forth. And so item 0 is that first value. So when we say get of this get column for position 0, we get that first value, which is the sales value in the first month. We can take a similar approach to find sales in the last month, but instead of getting index 0, we need to find index n-1. And this is where we'll define n as the length of our array. So if this had been index 1, then the last one would be index n. So because we start at 0, the last one is n-1. So in order to find what n is, we just said that's the length of the array. So we'll have to use the length operator. So that's something we can do in our JSON expression code. We take the length of our array, and that's going to provide us the value of n. Now, in order to subtract 1 from this to get n-1, we have to use the subtraction operator. So the subtraction operator works as you define the subtraction, and then you define operand 1 and operand 2, and the result is just operand 1 minus operand 2. So we provide in n, which is just the expression from the line above, so the length of that entire column, and 1 to get the value of n-1. And then lastly, now that we know what n-1 is, we have to take that entire expression and insert it into our get instead of this quotes here. So the final result is we're getting from our sales arrays, our array of sales values, the position n-1, which is the length of our column minus 1. So I know that that final expression might initially look complex, and it certainly looks long, but hopefully you can see that by breaking it down sort of step by step, each individual step is not too complicated. It's very logical of just, we're going to get an index, rating the length, when subtracting 1. And so now to put it all together into our entire difference formula, we now have sales in the last month and sales in the first month. We have to insert all of that into a subtraction operator. So once again, we're subtracting from the sales in the last month. We took that entire expression, put it into operand 1, and then sales in the first month, which is this entire expression, and putting it there. So we now have this entire JSON expression that tells us what the difference is between our sales values in the first month and the last month. So now, how can we use this value to influence the chart color? Well, we can use a conditional operator like case to set up sort of the logic that you see here. So when we're providing a value for color, we can use the case operator and say, if the difference, so that expression we just looked at, is greater than 0, then we want our color to be green. And if the difference is less than 0, then we want that color to be red. Now for our chart, color isn't quite as simple as just a simple string like green and red, because we wanted the gradient as well. So we can see that we define color here, and for each color we define the linear gradient and the stops. But the linear gradient will be the same whether it's green or red. So really what's controlling the color is what we're passing into these stops values. And so green would be passing in this RGBA string for those stops, and red is passing in a slightly different RGBA string. Basically, it's the same thing, it's just 128 is in the first column instead of the second. Basically, this is RGBA for green, this is RGBA for red. And this is how we can use sort of that difference in some sort of a conditional operator to provide different colors. So now we can go back to our chart editor and put it all together. And then back here in the chart code editor, underneath stops, I'm just going to move what we had down, and I'm going to define our case operator. So once again, I'll do the simplified version to start with. So if your difference is greater than 0, we're providing green. And if your difference is less than 0, we'll provide red. And now we can start inserting some of those other values. So again, green isn't really how we're defining green. We have to provide sort of these different stops values that represent green. So what we had before was green. And I'm just going to move that onto a single line. And we have to just encase this in brackets because it's a set of stops. So this is how we've defined green in terms of stops. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'll replace green with those stops. And then I'm just going to replace the same thing for red and just slightly tweak that RGBA string so that it's red instead of green. So now this is red, this is green and this is red. And now we have to plug in what difference is. So I'm going to copy and paste this from where I've saved it, so you don't have to watch me type it all in now. Just going to copy that in and then paste that in for difference. You'll see that it is that long expression that we saw in the slides just a minute ago. And at this point, I can click Format Code. And you'll see that it'll reformat it so that it's easier readable. Again, we're seeing these warnings, but we're not getting any errors, so it's not going to stop us from rendering. So we can ignore those for now. And when I click Apply Code, you'll notice that the change goes through, but nothing changed, right? Notice how the graph stayed green, because in our current view, sales is higher at the end than it was at the beginning. So we would expect it to stay green. Now to test if our conditional coloring actually worked, we can quickly add a date filter to our visual. So just like we would add a filter to any other visual in QuickSight, Highcharts, or native, we can come to the filter panel and add a filter. We're just going to add one on order date. And for this, I'm just going to add it to the top of our sheet so we can control it. And we can specifically choose a period of time where we know that the sales values is going to go down. So for example, we can see that it was high at the end of the year in 2023, and it's lower in the middle of the year, 2024. So we can choose something like go from November of 2023 through to end of July 2024. When we apply this filter, we'll see that now we see that our sales value is going down across this period of time. And as expected, now the color has changed from green to be red, and it still maintains that sort of gradient that we defined in these stops, but now it's the gradient of reds instead of greens. So at this point, we have created a visual using Highcharts that's essentially an enhanced version of what's available as a native QuickSight visual. So we're seeing the same data as we saw in this area line chart, but we're able to do tighter control over those colors and gradients and opacities, as well as having that really cool conditional logic to have that conditional customization on our visual. Now with that, we're going to switch gears a little bit to some of the other chart types, those that aren't just enhancements on the options already natively available, like the area chart, but instead looking at some of the newer or more bespoke options. So coming back to the Highcharts core demos, I'm going to leave the area chart demo and come back to all of them. And we can scroll through and see all the different options available. And I suggest, we'll share this link at the end of this session. I suggest that you all come here on your own time and look through all these different options and see which ones are most interesting to you. So scroll through these different sections on the line charts, the area charts, column and bar charts. As we come down to these pie chart sections, the one that I want to focus on now is this variable radius pie. Now this is a different type of pie chart that allows us to visualize across 2 dimensions. So like a normal pie chart, the first dimension will control the width of each slice. But then unlike a regular pie chart, we can have another dimension that controls the height of that slice. So just like before, we can open up the demo and the sample code to see what the chart type is. In this case, we see that the type is variable pie. So I'm just going to copy that for later. And then we'll come back to QuickSight. Once again, we'll add in a new visual and we'll choose the high chart visualization option. And then we need to provide our fields. So for just like any other pie chart, you have to provide some sort of categorical field and then some metric fields. So I'm going to do our groupings based on our industry field. I could have done it on something else like customer or product or state segment. For now, I'm just going to choose industry. And then normally in a pie chart, we would only select one metric like sales. But in our case, we can provide both sales and quantity because we're using the variable pie chart that allows us to look across multiple dimensions. So now that we provided that data, we can open up the Format Visual panel and come back to our chart code. Once again, we'll see that it has some default values here, and that's why it's rendering as a line chart. But I'm going to go ahead and remove some of those now. So once again, I'm going to get rid of the name. In this case, I'm going to get rid of the entire x-axis because it's not relevant to pie chart type visuals. And then instead of type line, I'm going to change it to type variable pie, as we saw from the demo. And then passing in our data, we need all three of our columns. So I'm going to get columns 0, 1, and 2. If I just format our code and click apply, you'll see that just like that, in just a couple lines of code, we're already able to render this variable pie graph. It already looks pretty good. Now at this point, we can make more edits and customizations outside of the chart code editor or inside the chart code editor. So we could come back to our API reference, we could read through all the different options available, we could look at the series type for variable pie and read through all the different options we have, or we can make some changes just through regular QuickSight instead of going through Highcharts code. So for example, let's say we want to sort our pie slices by height. From the way that we pass in our data, I know that our column 1 is controlling the width of our slices, which is sales, and column 2, which is quantity, is controlling the height of our slices. And so if I want to sort this by height, I'm going to sort on quantity. So I can just come to our visual panel and click those 3 dots. I can go to sort order. I can do sort order ascending or descending on quantity. So if I do something like descending here, you see without needing to code this, code some sort of sorting into our Highcharts code, we can use the regular QuickSight interactivity to sort this now. As we go around the circle, each slice gets smaller and smaller in terms of height. Just like we did with our line chart, we can also add filters the way that we would to our native visuals. So I can add a filter on industries. And in this case, we can say we just want to see the top 7 industries. So I can do a top and bottom filter, taking the top 7 industries by their quantity values. When I click apply, you'll see now we have 7 slices, and these are the top 7 industries by their quantity. Now, this made the formatting look a little different. You see like the slices, some of these slices are getting pretty small now, which is something that I don't want. I want the slices to match my intended look and feel, and I want them to be a little bit larger. So I'm going to come back into the chart code editor. I'm going to add a property for zmin. Just set it to 0. Now again, I already knew what I was looking for here. I knew what the zmin property was, and I wanted to add it in. If I didn't know that already, and I just knew what I wanted to do and make these slices, the smaller slices, larger, I could have come back to our API reference. I could have come back to series and looked for the variable pie series. So it'll be down here. And I could have read through each and every one of these properties, seen what each of them were. At the very bottom is where I would have found the zmin property, which is the one that controls the minimum z value for the points, each point's radius calculation, which is exactly what I was looking for. So I did it really fast because I already knew what the zmin property was. But if I didn't know, I would come back to that reference and I would read through those properties to see which one I wanted to use. Now, one more customization I want to change is I want to change the coloring of our chart. So I want to change the color of each of these slices. Now we have a couple different ways that we can do that. We can either start by manually adding colors into our chart code. So we come back to the series and look for a property on color and start changing it that way, the way that we did for our line chart. Or alternatively, we can just use the native QuickSight coloring options using QuickSight themes. So if I come to edit and I add a theme, you'll see that I've got some themes here. I've already gone ahead and pre-created a custom theme. You can create your own theme, of course, the way that you normally can in QuickSight. For this particular custom theme, I've defined my data colors as these various shades of blue. And when I go ahead and apply this theme, you'll see that it'll automatically apply to our visual. And now we've got our theme colors applying to our Highcharts pie chart slices. So basically, at this point, while the first visual we made, this area line chart, was a little more complex with those color gradients and conditional logic, for this example, we were able to create a pretty nice looking visual in just a few lines of code. In fact, in this chart code editor, there's really just, there's 9 lines, but really there's 3 lines that are determining, what data we're using and the type of visual. Everything else, applying the filters, applying this sort of sorting, applying the colors, we were able to do using the native QuickSight options, as we just saw. And again, this type of visual, the variable pi for analyzing across 2 dimensions, is not available as a native chart. It's not an option here. We have pie charts, but we don't have these variable pie charts. So this is only possible by using Highcharts. And more specifically, I also want to point out, we didn't have to make any changes to our data to make it work. We saw what this data looked like. It was a pretty simple sales data set. We were able to just provide that data into Highcharts. We didn't have to go in and make any sort of enhancements. We didn't have to do any calculated fields. This type of visual worked pretty much out of the box. So with that being said, for our last example, we're going to look at some of those chart types that do require changes to our data, or at least may require a certain format of data. So as we go back to the core library demos, I'm going to leave the pie charts and just go back to all demos. I'm going to scroll through and look at some of the more interesting options that aren't available natively. So for example, under the area charts, we also have this fan chart. So this is a chart that allows you to display a line series with various estimated ranges for forecasting values. So if we open up the sample code for this and we scroll down to look at how what the data for this series is, we can see they provided sort of this line data. So in this case, it's like the EU GDP in 2023. So they just provided, at a certain date, what was the GDP. But then more specifically, they also had to provide different series of data for each of these different ranges. So they provided a small range, a larger range, and an even larger range. And for each of those, they had to provide for certain date point in times, they had to provide lower and upper bounds. So basically what I'm trying to get at here is, these estimates, these upper and lower bound ranges, they aren't built into the fan chart type itself. If we wanted to use a fan chart type for our current data, we could pass in a line to show our sales over time, but we don't have the data in our data model right now to construct these estimates. And just by using the fan chart, it doesn't provide those estimates for us. So we would have to model that into our data, either before bringing it into QuickSight or using QuickSight calculated fields to create these estimated lower and upper bound ranges for our forecasts. And then we'd have to reference those values in the chart code as separate sort of data series as they've done here in this sample. So going back to the demo list, we can scroll down past all the chart types again. I'm actually going to scroll way down to the more sort of bespoke options. So way down here, we've also got the tree and network type visuals. So if we open some of them up, like for example, we open the sunburst option, we see that this is built using hierarchical data. And so we would need that type of data in our data set for this model to work. So in the example here, we've got like the continents, like continent of Asia, and then different subregions of that continent, and then certain countries that make up those subregions. So this is hierarchical data that's modeled into their data set, which we'd also have to have in ours to use this type of data, this type of chart. So in our case, looking back at our fields, we don't really have any hierarchical data. We just have one level of location, like state. If we had something like county or region, then maybe we could create that hierarchy, but it's not currently modeled into our data right now. So we would find it difficult to use this type of chart right now. Similarly, going back to the trees and networks, if we look at something like a tree graph, when we look at how these are defined, for each of these individual data points, they have to also provide what the from node and what the to nodes are, and also like the level of depth of this tree. We couldn't just take our sales data and stick it into a tree graph and expect it to become a tree. We have to model our data such that we're defining what these relationships are. In this case, it's languages. They're defining the to and from languages at each level of depth of this tree. So again, it's not something that we could use with our data right now. We have to model that in or adjust our data for that to make sense. So coming back to our DemoCentral website, and I'm just going to refresh the page here because my session is expired. Once this loads, this is our DemoCentral Highcharts page. We've got lots of samples here, and I'm actually going to scroll down just to show you. We've got some examples that use some of these more bespoke options, like this is a tree graph, and also down here, we've also got a sunburst chart. So if you're interested in seeing, if you have data that is hierarchical or you have data that has relationships, you can come to our DemoCentral website and see sort of how these charts were made, how they were defined, how they use that data to construct these charts. But for now, I want to show one more example. And actually, together, we're going to create sort of a preliminary version of this tile map. So this is another sample that we have on DemoCentral, so you can reference this later. But basically, this is the same data that we're using in our example. This is US sales data broken down by state. But this shape, mimicking the United States map, is not inherent with this visual type. This visual type is simply a tile map. We get to decide where those tiles are placed. And we do that by providing X and Y values, like coordinates, for each tile. So this has just been cleverly constructed so that each state tile has been placed to roughly follow a US map. But if you have state data, like we have right now, we have sales data by state. If we tried to just put this into a tile map visual, it wouldn't automatically take this shape. We have to provide that information externally. We have to enhance our data to include that information so that we can sort of structure it to take this shape. So I've actually gone ahead and created an Excel file that has that defined to my state tiles Excel. So here I've defined a really simple, I imported it incorrectly because I should have delimited it by comma. But basically for each state, I've got an X and a Y value. So for Alaska, it's at 0, 0. And you can see it's kind of an inverted axis. So like this is Alaska at 0, 0. Washington is sort of at 2, 1. So we can see that defined here. We're specifically defining for each state, we're defining an X and Y coordinate. And we're going to use that Excel file that I just showed to enhance our data. So I'm actually going to open QuickSight again in a new tab and come to our data sets. And here we've got our SaaS sales US data set that we've been using. If I just go ahead and edit that data set, I can add in that file. So I'm going to upload a file. Again, we can see where we're defining that X and Y for each state. I'm going to join that on our data. So I'm going to do a really simple join where the states are equal. And all this is going to do is now, once this loads, for each row of data, when we have a state, so for example, once this loads, this order took place in Alabama. We now know that Alabama has the X coordinate of 6 and the Y coordinate of 7. So we're just providing these X and Y coordinates for our states. We can click Save and Publish, and our data is going to refresh, and we'll just take 20 seconds or so. And then we'll be able to use those fields in our analysis. So I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to refresh the page. And these are going to be loading in with data right now because the data is refreshing in Spice. But we can already see that we have these tile map X and Y, which we can use as fields for our visuals. And I see that that's unloading, so I'm just going to refresh one more time. So our Highcharts load, and we're back to the same screen as before. So I'm just going to quickly add a visual. I'm going to add in another Highcharts visual. And then I'm going to add in the data we want to use. So we want to use our X and Y coordinates and our sales values. And open up the chart code. Again, it's populating with this default chart, which I'm going to change really quick. So we don't need an x-axis here. Our series is not type line. It's going to be type tile map. We don't need this name property. And for our data, we're just going to make sure that we're passing in all of the data that we need here, like so. Now, when I apply code, you'll see it kind of looks like the United States, but it's sideways. So I'm going to go ahead and add one more formatting option that I've prepared ahead of time. So under chart, this is a structure, and I need the inverted to be marked as true. I'm just going to format my code really quickly and apply. And now you can see it's now taking more of that structure of the United States, which we saw from the sample. So at this point, we're running out of time for today's session. So I'm not going to be going through all the other formatting options to go from this to this. But if you want to reference this later, you can come to DemoCentral samples page and look at it. Basically, they've done things like, gotten rid of the grid lines, hid the axes. They've got data classes here. So depending on what your sales value is, that's what controls the color of your tile. Out of these data labels for states, there's lots of customization options that have been added here that you can reference here. But even if you're making, a graph that isn't already a sample in DemoCentral, we could have come to the, API reference, looked for tile map, and read through all the different properties there to sort of get to the formatting that we wanted. So that being said, the key takeaways for today, what I hope you all got out of today, wasn't that you now know all of the individual options and parameters in Highcharts, but rather that you understand how you can use Highcharts and the documentation, like these API documentation, to create these highly customized visuals in QuickSight, both enhanced versions of the native charts, as well as more unique and bespoke charts. We saw how you can add as much or as little customization as you'd like, either through chart code with certain custom logic, or just using the native QuickSight features like the field ordering, the themes, and the filters. And hopefully you can see that some of the chart types will already work with your data, versus there may be those that may require some additional data preparation or specific formats like linked data, hierarchical data, and positional data, like we just saw with the tile map. If you're interested in learning more, all of the resources that I use today are available through DemoCentral. So coming back to that DemoCentral page, we've got the samples where you can look at that sample code. But then also at the top right, we've got some reference links. So this will take you directly to that Highcharts API documentation that I was looking at, as well as our own QuickSight documentation. So you can look at some of those like JSON expressions that we did. For example, some of those expressions, like this is where you could see the subtraction, for example. This is one of the operators that we used. So all that, those resources are here, as well as I find this link helpful for all the demos. So I'll provide that link in the chat shortly as well. Just want to show you where all those resources are, so that when you're all going on your own to make your own Highcharts visualizations, you know where all those are, and hopefully you feel empowered to make use of those resources to get exactly the visuals that you want.